We're back with Five Guys and a Bible, and today we are answering a question that was asked by one of our loyal viewers, my father. And he asked the question about cremation. This is actually something that I've been asked several times as a pastor, especially in recent years, as we've seen cremation grow in its popularity because of its affordability. And a lot of people want to know, is it something unchristian to do? Am I committing a sin if I have my loved one cremated? Is it a sin if my desire is to be cremated? So we'll kind of see how we feel about it, how we weigh in. We're going to start with Jason Schultz, who desires to be number one tonight. So Jason, take it away.
I don't really love the way you said that, John. You said before we started, we figured out the order we were going to do things, and you said Jason's number one. And I liked that. I just wanted to hear it on record. But okay, about cremation. I know that there's some folks who are really strong against it. And some of their objections are worth noting. I mean, the vast majority of the examples in the Old Testament of bodies being burned was either they were burned as a means of execution for sin or as an added condemnation for the sin that they'd committed. For example, you can go to Joshua 7. A fellow named Achan had sinned and brought judgment on the whole nation of Israel. As a result, he was stoned and then burned with fire. It seems like that command to stone him and then burn him with fire was an added condemnation for a sin. So that's where some of the objections for cremation come in. To me, though, the argument against cremation isn't nearly as strong as the argument in favor of burial. Because although it's true that the New Testament doesn't address cremation specifically, it does address burial. Jesus was buried. It seems the Israelites and New Testament Christians practiced burial exclusively. But most importantly to me, there is a picture in burial that makes a statement. In 1 Corinthians 15, this great resurrection chapter, Paul talks about the resurrection of Jesus. He talks about our hope for resurrection. And he uses burial as a picture of planting seed, the expectation being that there'd be a harvest come as a result. So, for example, he talks about our bodies, and when we die, we're buried. He says it's sown or it's planted in corruption. It's raised in incorruption. It's sown in dishonor. It's raised in glory. It's sown in weakness. It's raised in power. So there's a great picture there with burial. Because of that, my preference, I might even say my strong preference, is burial, because I like the picture there. I like the statement it makes. Is when somebody asks my advice, I always kind of guide them towards burial. But all that being said, while I have a conviction about burial compared to cremation, you're probably not going to find me making it an area of great concern in my ministry, because my concern is not what happens to somebody's body after they're dead. My concern is what happens to somebody's soul after they're dead. You can take somebody's body and put it in a fire and burn it into ash, but if they die without faith in Jesus Christ, there is no getting out of that fire. So if you're thinking about your own death or that of some close friend or family member, then let me just say I'm begging you to take seriously the more important question of faith in Jesus, because he died for sinners. You're a sinner. He was buried. He rose again, defeating death for all those who believe in him. So be sure that you'll face God with faith in Jesus when you die, and then all those decisions about your funeral and those choices you have to make will end up being joyful decisions that you can ask for God's wisdom in. That's all I got to say.
We're going to skip over to Troy McGahan on the right. Troy, go ahead.
Well, I lean more toward burial. Now, saying that I lean, I'm like Jason. I believe the example in the New Testament is burial. But can I sit here and tell someone, they come up to me and say, Brother Troy, I have a choice of being buried or cremation. And if I know their situation, they have no money, and it's going to be cheaper for them and less of a burden on their family, I just don't see how I can sit here and try to burden them with saying you have to be buried. I would tell them I believe the New Testament example is burial, but I cannot sit here and tell people that they have to be buried. I cannot see where that is a command in Scripture. So, to be honest with you, I don't have a whole lot to say about it, but I am interested in hearing what the rest of the guys have to say. So I'll stop.
That takes us then down to Todd Bryant. Todd.
Well, when we say the New Testament example is burial, now I want to make it clear, and I think Jason and Troy will agree with this. The New Testament example of burial is not modern 2015 American example. I mean, they didn't dig 6 feet under and drop you down in the ground. They put you in a tomb. So if we want to be, probably a mausoleum is a little bit more like New Testament burial, something like that, where they open the door and slide your casket in and close the door back. That's sort of like putting a big rock over the tomb like they did with Christ. He was buried in something that we would call similar to a cave. But let me also throw this out. I've noticed that as people often talk about cremation, they make the link between paganism and creation, and they'll draw all these ideas that cremation is what the pagans did. But let me explain plainly that almost everything about our preparation for burial today is similar to the Egyptian pagan rituals of embalming. They pulled out all the organs, they put all these chemicals in the body to keep it from decaying and things. So, we can't exactly say that we don't have a little bit of foundational things that are linked there, even in the way that we do things today. So that's not a very good argument. My opinion is that really this is a Christian liberty thing. I just don't think that it's a big deal. The law is an extremely specific thing. God never once ever condemns cremation. And I mean, he is very specific about a lot of things in the law. He does give the penalty for a couple of things being burning the bodies. Now, those are punishment for the wrong acts for people. And I mean, I guess that's noteworthy, but it's hard for me to say that cremation is sinful when in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 14, God actually commanded bodies to be burned. Whether it was punishment or not, it's still not sinful if God commanded it to do it. I mean, even when the Lord told Abraham to take Isaac, what did he tell him? Go take your son, your only son, and offer him as a burnt offering. That's what the Lord told Abraham to do. So you've got to consider that. Not to mention the cost of burial today has skyrocketed. I mean, funeral homes really are charging a lot of money. It's difficult to get somebody in the ground for less than $8,000 or $10,000 today. I personally know quite a number of families that have had to all go in together and take out loans that they weren't sure they were going to be able to repay easily. They were taking money away from their own house payment, their car payment, their kids' food or whatever in order to get somebody into the ground. I'm not sure that we might not could go to some passages in Proverbs and say that's not a very wise spending of your money either. So this is a lot bigger conversation probably than what is often looked at. We are comfortable with embalming a body, digging a 6-foot hole, dropping the box in the ground, and covering it up. That's not the way they did it in the New Testament. And that's certainly at least akin to the way that they did it in Egypt, and those things were definitely for the afterlife and some of those things. I think it's a Christian liberty thing. I'm like Jason. I'm not going to get caught up in somebody's personal decision. I think they need to pray about it. I really don't care what they do with my body after I die, to be honest with you. I'll be with the Lord, so it doesn't really matter to me. But I'm a lot more concerned about where a person's soul is going to be than I am about, whether they're cremated or buried. It's just not something I really concern myself with a lot. There's no scripture on it, really, so it must not be terribly important, is the way I look at it.
All right, that moves us up to Mark in the middle top.
Well, I probably have a more unique position. I'm not a unique position, but if you would poll these guys and say, how many of you all want to be cremated, probably the other four would say they would not vote that they want to be. Earlier today, I was having a discussion. A man died in our community, and the guy told me, well, they've taken him to crematorium and they're going to bring him back. And so had a discussion earlier today about cremation, and I said, that's what I want to do. I want to be cremated when I die. And the reason that earlier today when I made that statement, the reason that is I'm pastoring a church. I'm not pastoring in my hometown. My kids are probably not going to end up in this town that I live in. So if I would be buried in this town and my kids didn't live here, I've always worried about, I don't want to put a burden on my kids feeling like, we got to go back to Sayersville where dad's buried or go back to the hometown where dad's buried and, all that stuff, because I feel guilty about not able to make it back to my dad's gravesite as often as I should. I generally try to make it back once a year at Memorial Day, and it's just a burden people have to worry about. Here in the mountains, sometimes they're family cemeteries and somebody's got to cut the grass and just all kinds of stuff involved. And I don't want my kids to have to deal with that. And so earlier today, I would have said, what, I want to be cremated. After doing a little bit of study on this today, after I found out this was going to be the subject, I did a little study on it. And after reading in the Old Testament how all the people there were, most of them, it was a punishment and so forth, the reason they were burned and all that kind of things, kind of got me leaning like, well, maybe I don't want to be cremated. And then thinking about all of the examples about burial, Joshua or Joseph taking care of, making sure my bones are taken care of, and his dad, make sure my bones are taken care of and all of that. I thought, well, maybe, the Old Testament saints, they were kind of concerned about it. And in the New Testament, you see that they were concerned about burial. And so the practice has been burial, But really the scripture that kind of made me think, I don't know if I want to be cremated or not, was the fact that one thing we need to remember, our body is not ours, our body is the Lord's. And so we don't have the right to do with it as we want. We have to kind of feel like we need to do with it what he wants us to do. Now, I'm just talking to you about what's kind of gone over in my head, right? What these thought processes. Earlier today, I would have said, yep, I want to be cremated. Tonight, as I said before you discussing this subject, I really don't know if I want to or not. Maybe because of that example of the resurrection and the burial and all that and preaching of the gospel. Maybe there is something about the body being placed in the ground. So I'll have to say that maybe I do want to be buried now instead. But let me say this. In the state of Kentucky anyway, you don't have to go through the funeral home and all of that and have that elaborate burial service. You actually don't even have to be embalmed, but you have to be buried within 24 hours. You can't extend it out any. The body has to go in the ground almost immediately. As a matter of fact, you don't even have to be buried in a cemetery. You can be buried on your own property if you want to be. As long as and you don't have to be embalmed as long as you're in the ground by 24 hours. But I still, let's say I'm up in the air about it, but probably on a personal level, after doing a little bit of study tonight and thinking about the New Testament example, I'm probably leaning a little more towards I probably shouldn't be cremated. Again, that's just an opinion. Can't really say definitive on it, but earlier today I would have said, sure, yeah, I'm going to be cremated. I've told my kids, my family this a lot. Just take my ashes, burn them up, take them up on the hill behind the house, spread them out up there somewhere. And if you want to remember me, memorialize me, put a picture on your mantle and say, yep, there was Dad, we liked him, or yep, there was Dad, we're glad he's gone, or whatever. If you want to remember me, take a picture and memorialize me that way. Don't worry about, going to the grave and feeling guilty about all of that. And, just that's a lot of overkill in my opinion. But maybe I do want to be buried now after doing just a little bit of study on this. And I guess I'll be quiet after that. I didn't really give you any good information. I guess last subject, I was I don't know which way I stand on it. Tonight I've kind of done the same thing, so maybe I'm the most wishy-washy of us all. And I'll be quiet.
All right, that brings things to me. A couple things. Primarily in the Old Testament, when we look at it, it does, kind of say when we're talking about the burning of someone as it being kind of that punishment, so to say. But, we also have an example in the Old Testament where it wasn't a punishment, and that's with the bodies of Saul and his sons. In 1 Samuel chapter 31, in verse number 12, it says, "All the valiant men arose and traveled all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days." Now, bones don't burn easily in a normal fire, so they buried those bones. Now, when you look at that situation, David, was very unhappy with what happened to Saul. He praised the valiant men for what they did. So I don't see that as being a wrong action there is what took place. When you move into the New Testament, we even have an instance of, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. He speaks of even if he gave his body to be burned, he wasn't necessarily, in what way was he talking about? Probably in the fact that, burning Christians was common in that day and has been for some time. And by the way, why did they burn Christians in the first place? It's because, Christians talked about the hope of a resurrection. They thought, hey, we burn these bodies. We've eliminated your hope for a resurrection. But that's not true. Not true at all. We understand that it doesn't matter whether we're burned or whether we're buried or whatever it is. When the Lord comes, He's going to take His people home. And we're going to rise just like any other. All of our bodies are going to turn to dust, regardless of how much embalming fluid we put in them. That's what they're going to end up as. And with that, we'll also say this, and I didn't even realize this till earlier today, and Todd had sent me a little thing over it, and I started reading about it myself. When we think of modern cremation, we have this vision of our bodies actually being burned in a fire. But that's not what takes place. They are placed into the crematorium and they are subjected to high heat. That high heat eliminates the water from the body, the water content, shrinking the tissue down. And then what is left with the bones after they've been or whatever they call that process, of which they become brittle in nature, they take that material that is left and they actually pulverize it into a powder. So you're not actually getting ashes like we think of like from a fire. It's leftover material, about 3 to 9 pounds depending upon how large the person is. So when you think about it, if we were to put you in the ground, what would take place is you would naturally rot and turn to dust. What is modern cremation? What's it doing? Increasing the speed of the process into about 4 hours of time. So I don't have a problem with cremation. I understand a lot of people have a lot of reservations about it. I don't think it's a pagan process necessarily. I don't think God condemns it anywhere in particular, but I understand there's a lot of people that feel much more comfortable in being buried. But I don't think it really matters either way. I don't think we have any clear-cut scripture. So I've had people here at this church say, would you be comfortable with me doing that? And I have to say, that's your choice. I'm certainly not going to condemn you for it. And there's nothing we can do to this body that God hasn't already taken care of for those who are saved. That's for sure. So with that, does anybody have anything else to add? Of course. Troy McGahan, we'll start with you.
I just have one thing to say. Um, well, there that goes. That just went right out of my mind. No, seriously, I have it again. The only thing is if I was a missionary and say in another country where it was a pagan process, where it was looked at as part of pagan worship or something, then I definitely would not do it. I still don't think I would do it. But if it was going to be a stumbling block in that sense, absolutely, I would say get buried. Now, here in the United States of America, I don't think it's going to be a stumbling block. I still, God willing, would probably be preferred to be buried. But at the same point in time, if my son and my wife was going to struggle financially or not be able to make a house payment or something because of that, then by all means, that'd be something totally different. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there about if we were in a culture or society where that was part of pagan worship, then that, I think, would influence me a whole lot more. But that's all I got.
All right, that moves us to Jason Schultz, where the first shall become last.
Yeah, that sounds biblical. One of the things that Mark said just kind of sparked a thought in me, because he's right. I'd encourage you to be, if you decide to be buried, to be cost conscious when you talk to the funeral home. Because it differs state to state here in the United States, but there are some things that the law requires, but there's some things the law doesn't require, and not all funeral homes, I don't want to condemn all of them, but not all funeral homes are going to be real open about it. They're just going to say, here's all the things you have to do, and you need to actually ask, do you really have to do those things? Is embalming a requirement? What kind of casket, does it have to be in a sealed vault that the casket's put in? You're not doing anything wrong for your loved one by being a good steward of their money. Don't let anybody manipulate you into thinking that you have to spend more money in order to show how much you love them. I've already told my wife that if she wants to prove she loves me, she needs to just repeatedly ask the question, what's the least expensive option? And if she can get me in a cardboard box in the backyard, do it. That stuff doesn't matter.
All right. If nobody else, well, we got one more. Todd Bryant.
Troy, if you were in pagan Egypt and they were doing the embalming process and all of that stuff, I'm sure you would also tell a believer not to take part in that. Just go ahead and be cremated, right? I'm just saying. You're muted, but I'll go ahead and put words in your mouth. Yes, the clearly. My point is both directions probably have been used by pagans, but you know what? So the name of our day of worship, Sunday, was named by pagans. So if we just avoid everything and make everything bad that's ever had a hinge of paganism, we won't even go to the doctor. He's got the little serpent entwined on the staff there in his office. It's actually pagan. So really, that's just an argument that a lot of people, I think, use just as a straw man. But anyway, I know what exactly what Troy said. If you're in a society and whatever way they are burying you is going to be pagan, avoid it and do it another way that's not considered pagan in that society. I think we'll all agree there.
Mm-hmm.
If he knows how to unmute his computer, he can tell you himself.
Haven't we kind of clarified, though, that there's no sin in being cremated? If you want to be cremated, by all means, there's no sin in doing so. Have we made that clear?
I think so.
Biblically, there's no sin in it. And there'd be some people that may add some things, but you won't find a Bible verse that condemns it.
All right. Well, I think we've thoroughly answered that question from the perspective of these five guys. So, I hope it's been a blessing to someone and a help to someone as maybe you make some future plans for yourself. And, of course, if you have any further questions, you can ask them below on Facebook. You can submit them to the website, fiveguysinthebible.com. If you got any other questions, you can certainly submit those as well. We'd love to try to answer them. And we hope that you like us and share us. If you haven't done so already, here or over on Facebook and YouTube as well, that would help us get the word out. We certainly appreciate those who do share us. It has made a big difference, and we thank you very much. So with that, good morning, good night, whatever it is to you, but God bless.
God bless.
Good night.
See y'all later.